Let me welcome Dr. Simon. He's a professor of practice. He's a cognitive neuroscientist with over 30 years of experience in digital therapeutics. He has acted and developed the medicine for cognitive impairments, great inquiry, and is the former vice president and head of the cognitive science at Akili in Latvia. We are contributing to the first FDA-authorized neurogenic treatment for endeavor topics. And Professor Nathalie was also a professor at Space, and he co-founded cognitive company. It's not. No.
Yeah, that's much better. So he co-founded Cognitive, a startup focused on neurotherapeutics through young age. You want to hold the mic?
Yeah. But looking at we thank you for the invitation. We're excited to have been invited. I've been with colleagues for about 4 weeks, I think. You think? Okay. Yeah. And it was really generous of Nathalie to invite me to tell this long and strange story of how I got here from science. I mean, there's some science, which is fun. And I have some audience participation for that. So you understand you and Len. So if you don't go along with that, you can go. So let's see. Okay. So the story I'm going to tell you sort of begins here. And what happened was there was suddenly a shift in the very early 90s in development psychology with a thought that babies based on coming into the world knowing stuff that's kind of coded into their brains. And one particular area that I was involved with was whether this has to do with numbers and arithmetic and stuff like that. I mean, thankfully, if you think about it for months, crazy idea that babies will come into the world and not bad arithmetic. And I was sort of goaded into the response because of the computational modeling I was doing at the time to work on it before. So the question was, how might we explain this? But where these ideas come from? So there was actually some very elegant experiments that were done that leveraged the phenomenon that babies, talking about the first year of life, so particularly 5 months onwards, something like that, they will look reliably longer at things they don't accept. Things that don't seem to fit their expectations. They don't have expectations. And these kinds of experiments were beautifully done, but a bit over-injected. So in this particular experiment, which is the relationship I was going to focus on here, a baby will be sitting on the parent's lap. And they'll see this little stage, and an object will be put on the stage. And then it'll be covered up by a skin. And then the baby will see, for example, this situation, an object being placed behind the screen after the mother's being there. And then you drop the screen, and there's either an object, and an object, which is what you would expect, or there's just an object, which you would not expect, right? And babies will look much longer at being unexpected outcome. Are they doing arithmetic? No? So the notion that the regional stuff built into the brain really does not stand up really well about less individuals. So what I argued was, primarily from my previous work, it's very clear that for many, many years we had known that the sufficient, not necessarily sufficient competencies in these kind of things have been well documented in babies' ability, right? So they can represent objects, and obviously they can represent things when they're not there, otherwise they've been working as people or, objects and stuff like that. They can do physical reasoning. They know you can't walk through a wall or swallow through a floor or something like that. And also, they do this over time. Things move from one place to another. People come and go, and there's at least very basic physics exposed to every day. And obviously, they have remember things because they need there's stuff. Things that have actually kind of not complex memory, but babies that therefore lack of capability. So I built a computational model that comprises these things and these things only, right? And every sort of thing outlier and distinct. So then we tried to simulate the experiments. I won't go into the details of how you simulate the experiments, but to see whether we could actually get the same kind of results without the models having any clue about numbers on it. Yeah. So we did a replication pattern zone study. We produced roughly the same results. There was some other interesting things about the improvement more, but the focus here. So what you can see is that the longer looking times as they go up higher are when what what you don't see no like we say number word I said an object and an object, but what people are going 1 + 1 = 1 doesn't work, but 2 - 1 = 2 doesn't work, right? So that was the data from the experiment we ran the model. We got almost in exactly the same pattern of behavior, and it's almost actually the same reaction, the same time taken, the power model reduces response time, the stuff that not necessarily talk about in it. So the point was that's a sufficient explanation for what's going on. That's not necessarily what's going on, but Occam's razor would suggest that that's all we need, that's all we got. And then it turned out around about this time that these competencies were actually begun to be understood in basic functions of attention. So very quickly, your brain will only process what your attention selects for, right? So imagine yourself in a room, you got space and you have a flashlight. Your brain can only process what that flashlight lights up. And so you know that the attention is got like around some various different, various technologies, if I want to go into, but and so here's our first script, right? I want you to participate in this. Okay. Would you please get out as quickly as possible how many green boxes you see on one street?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. How about now? Very good. What, did you hear that silence? Right? So what happens is, it turns out attention can basically grab a couple of a small selection of items, up to about 3 or 4, all at once, without any clinical pressure. It's not spatially difficult to type. But so what then happens when we get to the second step, you have to do this huge spatial set. You have to put an object and cross it off and imagine count it. Find another object, so you go over there and you cross that one off, and you keep going. So it takes a whole bunch of time, right? And if you think about number notation systems, actually, it's pretty cool because think about like Roman numerals, it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you have a new symbol. So it suggests that you can't go more than that. And so one question we had about this time was, could this be an explanation of a whole lot of cognitive impairments that I was studying in various neurogenic disorders? Now, I don't have time to explain all of those, but I'm going to focus on one for a brief time. Which has the very clumsy name of the chromosome 20 involved on break-chain deletion syndrome. That's just because there's a deletion of DNA on its 22nd chromosome on the long arm. There's one particular one, break-chain 20. Let's leave it at that. There are lots of physical problems these kids have, and they have a lot of intellectual problems. And the parents were putting their own mistake. Man, they got no leadership problems. They don't find their way around. And I thought, okay, maybe this is something of an explanation. So we had these kids, and some typically developing kids, they were like 7, 14, do what you just did. And what you can see is that on the blue line that you see here is that the first 2 to 3 objects that the typically developing kids, they pretty much did it all at once, right? Roughly at the same time. And that was true of the first 2 objects for the kids with this deletion, and it's a little bit longer for the third one. But when you get past that 3 in the space, you can see that there's sort of increasing serial response time needed to get through the rest. And in kids with a deletion, it was much longer, and they have the same response time, it turns out. And so something was getting more difficult. And most interestingly, I think, for me, there was this undercounting issue, right? So that only about half the time did the typically developing kids undercount, like didn't get all the objects, but 70% of the time they did the deletion undercount. And my hypothesis here was that essentially their mental representation of space and time, it's a bit like having a low resolution camera. Trying to zoom in on a picture of a low resolution camera gets very blurry, right? You can't do very much accurate processing of processing a high resolution camera. And there's a whole phenomenon in visual neuroscience called crowding. It's to know how to accountability, but I'm still going to make reference to those 2 tests. And just to kind of back this up a little bit more, and have one more thing about my couple. But there are many theories and hypotheses about how these things, time, space, and quantity, were related together. I'm not going to go into them, but it's been long thought that they are. And of course, if you've had impairments on those things, it can lots and lots of implications. Regarding emancipation, recovery from stroke, which I'll look at, full risk and crash risk in elbows, and just the societal resources that get created as a result of them. Okay, so here's our next experiment. I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to imagine the numbers that say 1 to 500 lay there in some sequence. Now, the point physically for me, the way you think number 1 is. March 1 CDO. Okay. Now point to where 100 is. Okay, now where's 500? Beautiful. Okay, you can open your eyes. So what you did was this. Something's been reported for about 150 years already. Most people point you to around about here where there was 1, around about here where there was 100, and around about here where there was 500. Okay. And we read left to right. So we think about them in that order. In some cultures where they don't read left to right, they organize in different organizations. But here's the sort of resolution and crowding, right? You see that the first few, that's covered up. There we go. The first few are very distinct and separated, and they get very crowded later on because it's hard to kind of tell a lot of things from one another. So the idea was this is more accelerated or more increased in earlier on in the processing that gets to the nation. So here's your next task. So what we did was we basically went into the lab with these kids and we did sort of psychophysics experiments. So what psychophysics experiments is you ask them to show the difference between 2 different stimuli and how different do they need to be before you can reach a level of accuracy of activating stuff. Right? We did this in space and we did this in time. Okay, so ready for your next task? Which of the 2 bars that you're going to see is the longer of the 2? Question right? Versus this one. Best first one. Yeah, it's a little bit harder, right? Because the difference got a bit smaller. And so what we did was we did this like that, and then you get what we call the temporal duration, which we did ordinarily. You look at the 2 spatial makes the longer noise down out in the space, and that we created with these things that we know with kids, especially with development delay. Well, visually, which of the 2 pandas was on the screen longer? And then we had a pitch version of this, because pitch is not thought to be represented in the same way, right? So the question was, could they just do comparison without that problem? So I think we had about 2 little 3D versions, which had a higher tone than the other one. And you may not be still looking at graphs like this, or the 3 versions. The pink one is basically this. The little one is typically resolved because there's actually another group here who have an extra chromosome about why they're also next voice. But what you can see, the black line is just the median or the average of the groups. And the extent of the big colored bars, how variable things are. So it actually is statistically significant, probably because of the way the line is cut, the variation, that the difference had to be a whole lot bigger with the 22 when it should be kids to tell the difference in space than everybody else. And then also in time, there were maybe a much greater difference as well, but not in pitch. Everyone was very active, but there was one very little. So it suggests that it's not just, they're not about, they don't have an understanding of how to compare things. They have magnitudes of different sorts, but very specifically what the representation actually is. Okay, so everybody with me? So we're thinking along the lines of there being this kind of reduced resolution just basically from like these different varieties also. Right. So what are we doing? Well, it turns out that, right about this time, let's think about some evidence showed up, actually, Sean Green, that's in the Carly's labs, undergraduate, and so his postdoc under cognitive competency development. I'm sure it was driven by the fact, like, I'm playing more about video games, some of my friends, what's this doing for our brain? Brain blasters. And so what they did was a whole bunch of experiments with just the same experiments I was doing in my lab with these kids. So here's a fairly simple one. If you look at that progression box, the gray box, something like the first thing someone would see in a cognitive psychology experiment like this would be a screen with a little box in the middle. Okay? Then you see this wheel as it were, and in one of the locations is a seamless. And you get to look at that for a very short period of time and then it's been covered up, right? And then the wheel comes back and you say, which spoke was that on? Right? Not the easiest thing to do, especially for a very short period of time. If you look at the accuracy, The GVPs are the video game players, the serious video game players, and the NVGPs are the not video game players. So they took these kids, and you could see these were literally young teenagers, I think, or maybe little college students. The accuracy is so much higher, the video game players, and so much higher, up to 30 degrees of visual angle, which is really far out, and even beyond a lot of what video games would do. So this suggested to me that, this might be the treatment idea, right? Because it's enhancing those very things. In 2002, people were talking about digital therapeutics, so I just think maybe we can do something along those lines. So, that's not the prototype to pick up it's that thing. Okay, well, one video here. I will skip over. I won't put that one yet. So we actually built some desktop versions of this. We're just going to show the little thing. It doesn't really matter on the section. But we were trying to manipulate the crowd. So we had people that doing a task where they had to focus on this game, the little robot area, and they had to keep time when something was crossing the gate. While they were keeping time, we had these little scenery show up with there's an arrow pointing in a particular direction with one side beside us. We were manipulating the crowding around the arrow. And what we did was we took a bunch of folks. We had some health agent people, and we had some kids with these genetic conditions. And the kind of the white rat control animal in these experiments tended to be playing Tetris or about anyway, same kind of activity. So we had to play 1 hour a week for 4 weeks, either Tetris, and then they switched over to the second one, brain pixel, as we called it at the time, or the other way around, right? So sort of what sort of training stuff. And here's one outcome. This actually is this. Some of the kids for the So this is the Cambridge crowding part you see on the top right. So in one case, you see the validation is not being crowded yet, right? And on the other side, you see the O in the middle, you can see the O in the middle. And the closeness and the size of those objects are really backwards and forward. What's not crowded can get without losing that one in the middle. It's not just standard visual tests. So what you can see is that before anybody did training, the ratio was about 1.5 times to 1. The gap has to be about 1.5 times the size of the object, so the object stood out. And when they did Tetris for the same certain amount of time, it didn't change. There was no change in this whatsoever. But after the 4 hours of our brain pixel prototype, you can see they're getting very close to 1-to-1. In other words, they had less crowding, and you could pick out things that were closer together. Right? So kind of think about that line in space we like out. Okay, so shift. Suddenly I saw myself the founder of a startup, which is a terrifying thing from scientists for 30 years. And so we created Cognition. And the reason I won't go into, we had to pivot in other words to get market and to get invested into stroke rehab. The stroke rehab is really the same thing. It's the same system as spatial and temporal information. But here you have a system typically developing about damage as opposed to atypically developing, right? So, and stroke is a massive problem. There are about 800,000 new cases of stroke in the US every year. And most of them had upward geometric devastation. The control of your arms and your shoulders and your hands is very, very poor. Enormous challenge. So, the other side of the body. Okay. And there's about 4 million people in the US quote unquote actively recovering, because the problem is they don't recover very well. And the reason for this is every clinician will tell you, patients don't do their homework. Right? If you've ever done physical therapy, you've ever done what you're told to do. Right? So here's the state of the art. Right? Yeah. This poor guy wants to put a suit on top of another suit. Super exciting. Right? And he has no work in his right hand. And so he cannot get this to work. And so his brain cannot succeed at reactivity. What you see eventually is a clinician doesn't work.
Talk about turn.
And also you see something eventually called constellation. He leans forward and he does places that he can reach out.
We put it on top.
Okay. So his brain is just not executing those tasks. And this is what happened. And then we're going to do this for hours and hours at long. We sick and that doesn't fully hit them. And that's why people don't get better. So the insight that we had here was we can break down these activities of daily living into little tiny frameworks, which actually not what you've been is like cognitive, right? They're all pieces of movement. And you can combine those together in some vocabulary to make these activities that they are led. The key thing about digital therapeutics here, you can identify the very small pieces of activity and you set variables and then measure the ability of the patient in this case all the time. It's a closed-loop system. Like we set them a task, they do it, and see how well they do it, and we adjust the difficulty. We'll come back to that later. So that constant adjustment of difficulty, you keep doing right on the edge of where your capabilities are. So the active compound of the digital drug, and you need that it's a very small version of machine learning to constantly make that adjustment. Okay, and then treatment has to be early, intensive, and often. And that's not going to happen in CCANs, but if you can leverage VR, and the beautiful thing about VR is that bring things that's in the real world. You interact with the world, the same like written button, there's a screen. Yet you have total control of the physics. You can make impossible things possible, which is what the eyes therapeutics. So we can get them involved in this way. And in fact, if you do this, you do it right, you can move treatment out of the clinic where that clinician was into the home, almost anywhere. And therefore people can be pajama science whenever they want to, right? And then strongly the clinician at the bed. So it massively scales because of it. But here it's in context leading state. So we have base courses and quickly look at the targets of it. We'll chatting in the first moment. Targets that requires automatic. Right. But here's the activity. Oops. Cover it.
You can use the math.
Yes. Oops. No. This because we know exactly where the person's hands are in space and time, you can move those objects away gradually, bit by bit, and then require different capabilities. So we're constantly adjusting the difficulty all the time as they're doing this. And so also when people come back from the hospital and they're let out, they don't want to go back to a situation where they are, it looks like another rehab situation. So we created the Crystal Cove Resort. And the Crystal Cove Resort. And in fact, we even have this meathead trainer in the gym called Ronnie, and he actually gets you to do exercise at the beginning. So we can literally set your capabilities. It's a standard treatment, but it's personalized to you before you ever even start. This Ronnie will actually measure weight and movement capabilities, and that's what we set as the basis for the correct second. So, to expect this to recapitulate this, we then cognitive treatment like this. That we created on this cognitive we take a spatial temporal resolution, which is what's causing the challenge in the population, and we improve the neural control by taking this low resolution information, improving it with this constant adjustment, which the VR allows you to do. So think about it this way. In the example you see, where we have a covenant mediator, this person has a bird something like a mitten, and the object has like this taking contact it, you take that. When we think about this like having a giant sphere around each one, and what VR will allow you to do, which the real world won't, is that you just have to get these two close to one another, and you succeed. And now you've closed the neural loop. You've closed the intention and the cognitive plan that you had has been achieved, and your neural system goes, oh, success, right? Which the poor gentleman in CCAS was never seen. And as you gradually adjust this through space and time, we end up where you actually have the exact work that you need, and we have to get this really close together. And then when you make a movement, you actually succeed. So we can take a very impossible and very low resolution situation make a much higher resolution, get it to treatment. So one last thing about this, we took a very early prototype, actually a gentleman who was 6 years out of an incredibly serious stroke. He had not really recovered. And we basically, this was back in the Oculus Rift days, we had the towers and things. And there was a week where we did treatment. We were wondering why to make spattered up one of the towers. So we gave him this thing to knock himself out. He did it 5 days a week, 30 minutes a day. Like he literally himself 30 minutes a day. One is playing longer, except, I made up the nervous system. What do you attack? The goals of therapy are that, but no one does. So we exceeded them. And we were able to create a measurement that no one could create in the real world. So this is when people have stroke and they're reaching for an object, they often reach very wealthy in their blood. Something we say knock off, but they can pick up and miss it. So because you know where the hand control is going through space and time, and you can measure the resolution of that movement really finely, you're able to create a measurement of smoothness and reaching. And you can see that over time, from week 114, the wobbliness gradually disappears. And we became very much more accurate in reaching, which is another great aspect of this to go to measure the decades in the middle. Okay, so long story short here, I've been bumping around the world with digital therapeutics. Most of the people in that field, and the folks at Akili were leveraging this all the into the CSF for a very long time, and really exactly the same kind of science. But here we were focused on attention specifically, we talked about inspiration in the context of engaged learning. So here's my next science lecture for you. There are basically two major types of attention. We call it endogenous or internal, right? So here's this guy who's maybe working a report, and there's some brain networks going on, but he's decided that's his goal. And within the Endeavor treatment, this was created in what we call the navigation part. So you have this little avatar, and you're steering down the track. You have to hit these snake targets, and the speed at which you have to do it in the location where they are is constantly adjusted. So this one kind of attention while you're doing is top-down control. The other kind of attention is what we'll exogenous or external. So, the guy that people call police at pay will go up for lunch and switches and loses everything that's in front of him, and now his attention is somewhere else. And you have to manage these together. So this is what we call targeted component. And here what happens is while you're doing the navigation part, these little creatures will fly over the top of you, and you have to tap on them, but only if they accept the rule that you can get them. So this sort of blue one, if this rule was only red, or only a different shape, it's imagine doing these two things at once. There's a bunch of clinical trials that we showed how effective this was. But the crucial part about this is the need for this needs to be in competition with one another, because they're fighting for the same capacity, and that's how you get that point where the nervous system going, look, that worked, look, didn't, yes, it did, and that's how the process works. So this is Akili legal case with the Oakland South Africa. So we'll talk about Endeavor's legal here. But this is the general model about how we have to create these different neurotherapeutics. So at any point in time, you have a particular level of cognitive capacity. Right? And in this Endeavor situation, all of these things are fighting for that particular attention. So rule selection, what you have, literally the wrong one, fit on cell and so forth, right? And let's say for the moment that your task right now is while you're driving this thing, you actually have to decide whether to get this creature or not. Right? So there's only so much you can do. So you're fighting, the brain's fighting for that attention. And so there's a system in our brain called conflict detection. It basically says, hey, you've got to do this task and we don't have all the things we need to do. So what are we going to do? So the cognitive control system kicks in and it sort of adjusts the network. Say, our goal currently is this. Let's adjust what we're doing to try to execute that particular task. And in a closed loop vision neurotherapeutic situation, you do it in the following way. If that fails, you then have some kind of difficulty engine that makes it a tiny bit easier. So you can move people towards success. At least where that's called the SSME engine, something like that one. And then you repeat the process constantly, repeatedly. If, however, it succeeds, the network will kind of minimally code that change in. And the father issue of neuroplasticity, Don had said beautifully, cells that fire together wire together. Right? So you create a sort of an adjusted circuit on the basis of your brain goes, ooh, that actually worked. It adjusts slightly. And then what happens is you make it episode slightly more difficult, and you go backwards and forwards like this, like very long period of time. But notice the point is, you constantly have to be operating right at the difficulty that you're at. It's easy, so easy. We just make it harder. It's too hard to make it easier. It's always going to be at that threshold. So essentially, the active ingredient of the drug is this conflict process and setup, and the difficulty just reaching somehow, Okay, now I'm going to take a giant deep micro, because these things look like games and they're designed games. That's very good reason why you would use a game structure to do this, which I don't have time to answer now. It's lost in English, right? Right. Okay. So in cognition, in language, our brains are set up to only make sense of something that it comes in by using the knowledge that we already have. And that generates understanding, comprehension, and expectations, right? So your last task is, tell me what these are about. The first one is not about orthopedics, right? The second one, didn't you know what the second one is? One of our some favorites.
British invasion on the Falkland Islands.
Thank you, Noah. The British invasion on the Falkland Islands under Margaret Thatcher caused some real problems in the left of center group. And so they didn't, go away with the battleship and left breakfast materials on the islands. They just wanted to show how to respond, right? And finally, I guess I got fixated on breakfast here. When Prince Charles was ascended to become with King Charles, he went to France and he gave French toasts. But didn't really, right? So you have to know what's going on. And in fact, I had my third example. It happened to me. I'd been to the US for the first time in 1983. I saw this sign in the cafeteria at the University of Texas, Austin. I couldn't make sense of it. This is what the sign led me to believe, right? I could not make sense of the sign until I realized that someone formulated that a bus is actually what I put. It's probably, and it's a verb, it's not an name. So I just had no knowledge to make sense of place. So I'm going to have you do an exercise here. I think this should show you that before we get to the fun. So here's a word that everybody knows. What kind of word would you think would come next? What category word? I mean the word itself, but what kind of thing comes next up with the
Noun.
noun? Great. Oops, 4 adjectives. Okay. What comes after an adjective?
Noun.
Noun. Great. Okay. What comes after a noun usually? Whatever. Oops. What's happened here? Okay. Well, now we're unstuck, right? And now we've got this word. What does this mean?
You couldn't pedal it?
Well, you can only figure it out if you go back and observe your noun. Got it? So you actually get to the end of the sentence, if you don't know what it means, you have to go back and reprocess it. So the point is what I'm showing you is that you have to keep using your knowledge to make sense of something. When you do, you expect something to be had with it, right? And you get it out of the standard. So why am I going down this route? Well, the reason is, there's a very important reason to use games to create digital therapeutics, but there's a real problem in the real world, okay? And that is that if you lead people to expect they're going to play a game, they're going to have expectations about what they'll want. This was something you really ran into like Akili, especially when we went into the OTC, the open accounts thing, and we were in the App Store. So, as I said, existing knowledge gives you expectations, but like it's a game. These are in some dictionary definition. It's amusement, it's diversion, right? That's what you would expect. Therapeutics are remedial treatment of some kind of disease. There's a thing about physical therapy. It's not fun. It's often, you don't know what to do. You have to get a physical therapist or then turn the phone and so you go to exercise deep. And you have to get a little bit harder and harder. You have to get back with a lot of time, a lot of energy, possibly a lot of money. And it's not going to be pleasant. So if you kind of just emphasize in games, so for your game designers, it's great, but if we just think about this as gaming, all this is gaming, you'll find very quickly that people will refuse to pay for your product. In fact, we literally, this game sucks. Was it going to respond to God? So because it can never beat the state, it constantly has to go through that level, right? They expect amusement and diversion, and they just churn out of your business because that's the one. So you have to get them to buy in to the fact that this is not going to be fun. It's not going to be easy. You're never going to beat it. You're going to have to put that time in like we do with this book out. And that's difficult, not least because for search engine optimization, people keep typing in, our video games good for my brain. So you have to find a way to do it. So that's what I wanted to leave you with, right? You have to have a game structure to make this stuff work. When you're going to be very consistent about the community. So we need to work with one another, but there's a real difficulty in getting on what this is when you get to the end. All right, so that's what I wanted to cover.
Just please raise your hand and someone with the mic will come to you so we can hear you on mic.
Even though what's it? It goes next to the location.
Thank you, Pat. I just have a quick question about this last part that you talked about. How integrated this is into like prescription medicine, right? Because the idea is that if a doctor prescribes you the games, right, your sense or your expectations might actually get adjusted rather than you going out there or like somebody recommending it as a game, right?
Yeah. Exactly. And in fact, what happened was Lilly's model was a prescription digital therapeutic and for kids. Okay. So the parents go, this is prescription medicine, right? You can't go, right? So they have to be kind of like really in charge in some way. But that's where it gets difficult. Now, the adult version, was the counter model that we did later, was people essentially either knowing that ADHD or even self-diagnosing themselves. So they came into sort of completely different mindset. That's why I went into this novel. Like, that was not the same thing. Right? This is supposed to be helping people, and it's big, but I hate it. So what to do? So it's very complicated. But we're right. Who's the provider of the medicine side? Then it might make you think about it digitally and operations. Definitely does.
Yeah, in the example of sagging the zooms, right? If you try to create habits or rubber bands or anything to try to generate the same effect, first the way that it was.
Great question. Yeah. So back in this is sort of back in the early-ish days. This is about 5-6 years ago of PR. I mean, it wasn't easy to do practice very useful, and we wanted to get rid of, we wanted really to get rid of the controllers links so we get into grips and stuff like that. But the technology wasn't there. But this was so incredibly successful. I'm telling you, we would go into the hospital and have some of these patients do it, and they would start screaming with joy. And they'd listen, oh my God, this is incredible. Because 3 minutes ago, they couldn't do this. Right? And now suddenly they can close that loop. Like, I want to get this demo and pick it up and put them in. And now there's incredible stuff like that happens. And they would just go completely crazy. And part of the reason was their disabilities sort of disappeared suddenly. So if you want to have this treatment early and intensive and often, that's feedback we get. So being competent is incredibly powerful. So there's a lot of sophisticated ways you can do all of this stuff for sure, but you don't need it to make this stuff work. I mean, it's just that situation happened. Dr. Bruce Hopkins is one of the world leaders in neuroscience and technology. And we were working with them, and he brought some of his patients in, and we started by watching patients that were missing play testing come up with strength, right? And so we were all watching them, and I started watching, and his mouth was hanging further and further into the academics. Insane, just so blown away by it. So I'm gonna exploit my team to a quick little family. The reason why I gained this, because if you imagine that thing like showing when we're studying the average situation, you'd have to say to somebody, okay, turn this cognitive process on, turn that one on, now that one's like that, turn that one down, turn that one up. You can't possibly do that, right? But if I say, here's a game to play, when the only way you can play it is by using those cognitive processes, so you get the cognitive neuroscientists and say, what are the processes that are necessary? And which ones need to be guided with one another? Which ones would you adjust? Right? That can then be built into a very difficult, very sophisticated, and ends up breakthrough analysis. But you say people go, right? And they do it. You don't have to explain anything to them. And that's the only way you can literally keep turning the dials of their cognitive processes up and down. you kind of need that. There isn't really any other way to do it because the demand structure and goal and dynamics that we gain enable that to happen. But I mean, then you have this other thing. So it's a really difficult thing of many to this. Such that
To ask about in terms of expectations, the idea that game design most of the time is about win or lose situations. And in your testing people, does that desire to win or the not wanting to lose, does that affect either positively or negatively?
that's exactly the issue. So when we went to the App Store, right, to that application, there were a lot of people who thought, like, I want to get this ADHD problem related, right? Instead, really wants to say, I don't get enough stuff here. But a whole lot of other people, like, this one totally sucks because I can never lose. I just lose here all the time. Right? Or it's the best I can do is not lose. Right? It's very, very difficult. But the point is, as I showed you now, there's no other way to get neuroplasticity to work. You don't want to win. So it's really challenging to get this. Like that is what you triple what we're up against. So you need to really make this.
And the more it looks like a game, the more
they expect. Exactly.
Yeah, internally you want to win or lose.
What's the option? Yeah. Here comes the challenging question.
You have to speak close to the center. So this right about expectation and the learning process. It has a lot of cultural context. So that means that if it's something you're not good at something, I want some of those rights that's looking like. And a lot of the video you're talking about, so far it's there what? And now it's like check it and swarm that it was bad. But it's different than the hard to do it.
That's a very, very good question. So that there are these very real differences in committed strict. And in fact, I don't want to demean this process, but I will tell you that the version of the Endeavor that I actually used, some of the things I was doing with the terms of the Japanese localized version, was quite different in some ways. And the early versions of Endeavor in this country have these ambassadors who basically work harder and all it. You can build it. And the Japanese version, they must have the reasons, kind of yells at me. And it says, I'm working hard, do it more. And I was really surprised and shocked by that. So that must be somehow a reflection of the different culture. I don't know if it's a good response or a bad response, but you're exactly right. As you localize these things with language, you really have to think about what the expectation is going to be in that situation too. So yeah, there's no one size fits all here. So again, you've got to know your customer, you've got to know your user, and when you don't do that, then you give them a solution to a problem they don't want. But in segments where get challenging, but which they're not worried about. And in case you don't know, the Endeavor product just got approved by the Japanese version of the FDA. And they have a prescription very good listens on the bone GABA. And so let's see. I mean, it was effective. I looked at the data in some circumstances. Then it's a clinical trial. Before they custodians.
Thank you so much for this. This was really great. I really enjoyed the lessons that you had for us. I guess one of the things, my father developed Parkinson's in the past year and a half, and my mom has been, the range to change everything. So I can see this model being explained to the caregiver, and working together. So I guess first question is, are you finding this working with Parkinson's and movement disorders, and then also are you working with families in addition? This part of the training.
Yeah, that's super quick. Thank you. Sorry to hear about the development of the committed work that's really developing. And we had a very small startup with small amount of money. In fact, we were about to, we did it a little bit later because we were about to start a trial with the Kaiser Foundation in Lab Center in Vallejo, and the pandemic only just their our investment went away at the same time. But exactly right. It's not just a solution to one thing. You have to know what it is you're trying to do in the person's brain to get control of it. So you want to have different variations. Movement disorder is really just a variation on this post-stroke rehab control. It's a different cause, but many similar problems. So it could easily be adjusted, not to like, oh dear, I'm giving you a drug for COVID, I'm not going to give it to you if you have, appendicitis, right? So we'll adjust it with them quite good. And then your second one is really important. We went for frictionless. Frictionless was an excellent key, right? So in other words, we wanted this treatment to happen outside the clinic at home. And so it had to work out of the box. Otherwise, it would never be used. And so we put an enormous amount into the two. We used to know the FATUI there, the first time user experience, right? So literally, the control button, put it on your head, press the go button. All different gate controls used to happen with the subject. I mean, it does everything else. So the problem is, if you have stroke, you may not be able to get it on the head. You'll be all right. You'll be able to pick up. And so, absolutely, it always involves the families. But also, the other side of that point is, if there are care teams that are really seeing the person working that hard, it's important thing is that really get motivated to deal with shared, right? So it's a totally got to stay happy. But yeah, that's a really big challenge of spreading it since it's frictionless as possible. Otherwise, it don't get eating. So it's up. I was saying the best medicine drug, there's nobody who won't swallow it. So you got to better work on all of that. But just look at families we buy in one that's just exception. What? So thank you. Thanks for reading. Thanks, everybody. Great questions.
Thank you for the fantastic debate. We will take a break for lunch, and we'll be back with I know at 1 p.m. So if you want to break, you get your lunch, sit at the tables, or sit outside, some connect, let go. Thank you.
I'm following. There's a little bit more.